This is our third message now, church, in this series we're titling God Draws Near, where we are tracing the theme of God's presence in the storyline of the Bible. And it's a very quick review of what we covered so far, especially as we had a week away due to the snow. Remember, in our opening message, we were in those important, very beginning Genesis chapters 2 and 3. And there we saw that we were designed by God to live near to God. But then, due to sin in our hearts and in who we are now, we were fittingly driven out of God's presence. And then last time we were together, we fast forwarded to Moses on the mountain with God, and there God told Moses how in the tabernacle, God was going to draw nearer again. And he did. But then, though, remember, we ended our last time by seeing amazingly how, after all of that from God to Moses, the very next story in God's Word is that famous story about the golden calf. And Aaron, as the priest, like Adam in the garden, just allows the people to walk into sin. And therefore, we ended with, and so that is meant to show us, this tabernacle is great, but it isn't going to be the ultimate answer. It's going to be the way to reverse Eden and to have God fully draw near. So that's where we left off, which now for this morning, as you heard, brings us to Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a prophet much later in Israel's history. So we're fast forwarding a good amount of the Bible's storyline. And if you're newer to the Bible or if it's just a little bit fuzzy to you, here's all you need to know. What happened 30,000 feet between Moses all the way to Ezekiel. So Moses gave all those instructions. The people, of course, were still sinful. And then that generation doesn't, but God's people eventually do get into the promised land. Then in time, they want a king. And then there's King Saul, King David, and then David's son Solomon. And then it's Solomon who finally builds the physical temple, replacing the tabernacle and making God's presence permanent like that. And though it's Solomon's son who isn't a good king, and because of him, the whole nation splits into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom called Israel, the southern kingdom called Judah. And then concerning those two kingdoms, in brief, for all those years, the northern nation basically never has a good king, faithful to God, and so they're exiled or kicked out in 722 BC by the Assyrians. And then the southern kingdom, though, of Judah, they had a few kings who were faithful to the Lord, but most of their rulers as well were evil, leading to them being exiled in 587, 586 BC. And concerning Ezekiel, here's the point on him. He was a prophet during that second exile of Judah. And concerning our theme in the series, church, here's the basic thing for all of us to recognize. All of that, the whole story leading to exile, was going on with the tabernacle and then the temple there. Right? God being nearer to this people in a way, more than any other people on the face of the earth. But then they were still so sinful year after year. Eventually, as we see here in Ezekiel, is God who not only exiles them, but it's God who decides to make a change in his presence among them. Okay, so that's where we are. So now, though, let's just get into our passages here in Ezekiel. And church, like we have kind of for 2 Sundays so far, we're going to cover a lot of ground this morning, but I do hope this will help us to make a lot of sense of the storyline of the Bible and appreciate God's presence with us. So again, we're going to be Ezekiel, only Ezekiel this morning. But as for how we're going to go through all of it, we're going to have 3 sections now from here on out. 3 sections. First, and most briefly, we're going to be in those verses of Ezekiel 8 that we just heard read. And we're going to start there because that gives us some background on how it was going by the time of Ezekiel. Even how it was going with God in the temple. So that's first. So second will lead us to see what God then does very climactically with his presence in some of these verses in Ezekiel. We won't spoil it for now, but it's huge. Which that third note, though, and for our biggest section this morning, will lead us then to look at a ton from Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, which is this massive prophetic promise of a much greater city and temple in God's greater presence. So for a third section, we'll talk about that and how that applies.
So see, that's where we're going to three sections. First, how is it going? Second, what God then does. And then finally, third, what God promises at the end of Ezekiel. And as you see, once again, one way or another, all of this will be met to us.
All right, that's that, church. Let's just dive in and begin our first section here in Ezekiel 8. And again, this will be our quickest section because this just sets the stage for what's going on and how bad it's gone. And just so you know, for us in this room, we got to avoid reading this and feeling, oh, they're just the worst. Because really, God had the whole storyline of the Bible hacking church, so we could see a lot ourselves as well, to show us that truly, to whatever degree, we would all be like this if it wasn't for the grace of the gospel. All right, so Ezekiel 8, 5 through 16. And just so you know, what's got to be going on here, Ezekiel's given these visions by God as is typical of the book. And in this vision, we're going to take it in 4 chunks because God is going to show Ezekiel stuff that's going on first from further away from the temple, then at the entrance of the court, then a little closer in, and then in one of the inner rooms of the temple. So God's essentially taking Ezekiel closer and closer to his presence. And he sees this. Look down at verses 5 and 6 to start. Then he said to me, Son of man, lift up your eyes now toward the north. So I lifted up my eyes toward the north, and behold, north of the altar gate in the entrance was this image of jealousy. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations that the house of Israel are committing here to drive me far away from my sanctuary. But you will see still great abominations. Okay, so as you can see, Ezekiel is being shown this by God, and what's he see? Well, you heard at the end of verse 5, quote, in the entrance was this image of jealousy. Being an image, that means it's an idol, probably a Canaanite god, if you had to guess. And notice, it's not just that makes God jealous out of love for his people, but it's, quote, that it's driving me away from my sanctuary. I'm back to that. All right, that's verses 5 and 6. On the idol that they're worshiping, which next Ezekiel gets closer in. And now look at verses 7 through 13 and what he sees. And he brought me to the entrance of the court. And when I looked, behold, there was a hole in the wall. Then he said to me, Son of man, dig in the wall. So I dug in the wall, and behold, there was an entrance. And he said to me, Go in and see the vile abominations that they are committing here. So I went in and saw, and there engraved on the wall all around was every form of creeping things and loathsome beasts and all the idols of the house of Israel. And before them stood 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel, with Jahaziah, the son of Shaphan, standing among them. Each had this censer in his hand, and the smoke of the cloud of incense went up. Then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each in his room of pictures? For they say, the Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land. He said also to me, you will see still greater abominations that they commit. All right, so what's going on here? Well, basically, they're worshiping all types of animals and beasts inside of some hidden cave-like room in this larger temple complex. And so they're kind of hidden, but God sees it. And he tells Ezekiel in a powerful way, right in verse 12, that look at what they're doing, quote, in the dark. Each is wearing pictures. So next, these are verses 14 and 15. So what there? And it brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord. And behold, there sat a woman weeping for Tammuz. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? You will see still greater abominations than these. Okay, so it's even closer. This is now at the northern gate of the very temple itself. And what's going on here? Well, women are weeping for Tammuz. And who is Tammuz? Well, basic Tammuz back then was a Mesopotamian fertility god. And to honor him, you would mourn for him and cry when the harvest season ended, hopefully showing him honor so that he'd give you more crops when the next season came. So think of it. They're turning away from the Lord, and instead they're honoring Tammuz like this. So let's most of these verses stick with me, at least the climactic verse 16, look at verse 16. And he brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and behold, at the entrance of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs to the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, worshiping the sun toward the east. All right, this is climactic in the inner room in the temple. And most likely, we need to know it's just all priests He was only priests were allowed to go here. And so if you're tracking, we've had men, women, elders, priests. And as for these priests, what are they doing? Well, the very temple itself, closest to God by far, that they're not facing God and where he is in the most holy place, in the holy place. Rather, they have their backs toward God and they're bowing down, worshiping the sun. Now, I once had a professor provocatively said on this that they are essentially like mooning God here. And I bring that up because although there isn't actual nudity here, for example, so it's not actually that yet, they are turning their backs and bowing down and worshiping the sun, and thinking of mooning kind of gets across a similar shock that we should feel when we read that. All right, so that's Ezekiel 8. That's our quickest section. And honestly, without applying that too much to us yet, church, all we need to know is, and that's a picture of where the old covenant by itself eventually led. Not because God is bad, but because God primarily just being in a physical temple, and then his people with their kings and prophets and leaders, it wasn't enough. Meaning they needed something greater. And again, to be crystal clear, you can read that and think, but that wouldn't be me though. And I say that especially because, again, remember, men and women and elders and leaders are here. And so this is meant to represent the whole of God's people apart from the greater grace of the gospel of Jesus. Because they have God nearer to them than any other people. He's right there in the temple. But they eventually turn and direct their hearts elsewhere. Frank, it's our first section. Which next now for our second leads to what happens from God's side. This will also be briefer to save time for our third section of the church. In the history of the world, in the storyline of the Bible, this is we're about to be huge, bigger than people often give credit for. For this, we're going to now be some verses in Ezekiel 10 and 11. So Ezekiel 10 now, we should almost be there. As you can see, it's in the header above Ezekiel 10, it tells us it's about to happen. Because the ESV says, quote, "The glory of the Lord leaves the temple." That's what's going to happen. But now, let's read some verses to see for ourselves. Starting in just verses 3 through 5 of Ezekiel 10 now. Church, this is another vision given to Ezekiel. It's going to be poetic, but please just pay attention to the cherubim especially, because they represent where God is. So verse 1 starts with, "Then I looked and behold," and now skip to verses 3 through 5. Now, the cherubim were standing on the south side of the house when the man went in, and a cloud filled the inner court, and the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the house. And the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord, and the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard as far as the outer court, like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks. All right, so here's the point of that. After such idolatry and turning from God for years and centuries even, Ezekiel is now given vision in the temple itself, and he sees the symbolic presence of the Lord, the cloud and the brightness, and around the cherubim, he sees that church go up and rise. That's the point. And then it goes, verse 4, quote, "to the threshold of the house," meaning the steps to the entrance of the temple. So feel it. God himself is rising. He's heading out, which eventually, just to skip ahead a bit, leads to God's presence even going further away. Stick with me for this. Go to the last 4 verses of Ezekiel 11. Last 4 verses. So find Ezekiel 12 and look right above us. It's Ezekiel verses 11, 22 through 25. "Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the Lord was over them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the boundary that's on the east side of the city. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me in the vision by the Spirit of God into Chaldea as the exiles. Then the vision that I had seen went up from me, and I told the exiles all things that the Lord had shown me." All right, so again, we here understand that as mere, sure, that's a massive moment in history. Because the big point of God choosing his people was to be nearer to them. And he was in the temple. But now
he's left. First was up, goes to the steps. Then, as you can see, verse 23 here, he then leaves the temple ground, goes to the city itself, and then from there, he even goes from the city to a nearby mountain east of the whole city. Meaning God's presence now is not in the temple or over the temple or even over the city of Jerusalem anymore. He's left. And yeah, there's even some out in this and that church. One smaller groups of boat, one the massive cross of folks, which will lead us into our third section first. For the smaller groups of boat, this is small but also really beautiful and shows us God's heart. So God leaves the temple, showing that's over. And yeah, did you notice God went east? And that's significant because we need to know that people who were exiled during this time, they were exiled to east, to Babylon. And so even when God leaves, he's showing, but I'll be near to my people the way still, even if it's their exile. And it's a smaller person, folks. But this second, much bigger than that church, if you're connecting this to us, is even in the midst of all of that. So that's the main message. He was at 10:11. God's leaving. And yeah, as that's happened, so you look out Ezekiel 11, 19, and 20. I know we're looking at a lot of places. 11, 19, and 20. This is one of the 3 or 4 main places in the whole Old Testament that something much better is coming. 19 and 20. And I will give them one heart, and a new spirit I will put within them. I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my rules to obey them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. Let's look at this. In the midst of God himself leaving due to real sin, he's making it clear that his plan isn't over. Rather, something even bigger, better, more comprehensive, and complete than the Old Testament and its temple is come. And now, Ezekiel does not use the term new covenant that Jeremiah does, but I want to let you know this is very similar language here to what Jeremiah references in his book. Plus, Jesus himself, when he has that famous conversation with Nicodemus about being born again, Jesus is referencing this Ezekiel in Ezekiel 36. And so we need to feel this. God is leaving the temple where he has dwelt nearer to this people all the way back from the time of Moses with the tabernacle. He's leaving. But when he leaves, he hints that an even bigger, more comprehensive solution is coming. Which, of course, as we're going to talk about on Wednesday and Christmas Eve, and especially next Sunday together, this all does lead to the new covenant, the New Testament, same word to be Greek, which begins at Jesus' coming at Christmas. And we hopefully know that, but I hope you see it here. See God's heart. As he was leaving, he's making it clear that that's fine. All right. So that's our first 2 sections. I hope you're tracking. There's sin. God believes, but he also promises something greater to come. But that now all leads us, church, to our third section, which on the one hand is where this gets a little bit more complicated for sure. But on the other hand, once we understand this, this is where it all comes together. And for this, please now turn with me to Ezekiel 40. Ezekiel chapter 40. Because for our third section, we're going to be a bunch of places from Ezekiel 40 through 48. Because the whole book of Ezekiel ends with this one long single vision encompassing chapters 40 through 48. So please, if you can, turn to Ezekiel 40. And on this vision, stick with me. What we need to know, church, is that, again, this is one vision from chapters 40 through 48, given by God to Ezekiel. And, in fact, it's given years later than most of the book of Ezekiel, because as you're going to see, the people have now been in exile for 25 years when Ezekiel receives this vision. And 30,000 feet on this vision, here's the big point, and why I think it's actually really helpful for you and me in a place like church here at Christmas time to dive deep into this, even though there's going to be a lot, to dive deep and to appreciate it. So stick with me there. But what we need to know is that the way that the vast, vast majority of Christians throughout history have read all this is that Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48 is God promising at the end of this book where he's left
and made all these promises of something greater to come. Well, this is now a vision of God basically causing that he's going to come back, but in an even greater way. That's the big one. God is going to come back, but in an even greater way. And the image that God uses to get that across is one less familiar to you and me, but hopefully in our series we're a bit more familiar with it now. And remember, it was much more familiar to them, and it fits the context of the book of Ezekiel so well, and that is the image of a temple. A temple. All of this in Ezekiel 43 to 48 is an image of a city, but especially of this massive, climactic temple. And concerning the city and temple, here's where it connects to us a lot in our day and age. So the past 2 centuries or so, especially in America, due to certain theologies, people have decided to take all of these details in here very, very literally, or literalistically might be the better term. And we're going to talk about that more as we go. But for now, we need to know that what that has led to is that since this exact blueprint of this massive temple wasn't ever built in history, like in the Second Temple age where the Jews did come back into their land, and also since this exact blueprint hasn't been built since, that type of interpretation says Ezekiel 40-48 hasn't been fulfilled literalistically yet, and so it must be pointing to an actual physical temple structure that's going to be built. Right? Either in our history, but especially most people who take that say it's going to be built over the millennium. And I know many of us in here probably have heard that. We may believe that. We may assume that it's obviously true. And we probably see things online or in the news that talk about that, but another temple may be built. But to be honest, church, that just has not been the majority dominant Christian position throughout history. For people who genuinely love Jesus and honor his word. Rather, it is a newer way of reading Ezekiel from kind of the 1800s on. And people read it that way because they often think in order to take the Bible seriously, you have to read it very literalistically. Here's the big thing for us to think about. Instead of taking the Bible literalistically like that always, we always want to take the Bible seriously as God's word, but literarily. Literarily, meaning if God is using a certain type of literature to communicate something like poetry or apocalyptic literature or lofty hyperbolic poetry, like here, we need to take seriously what God is trying to communicate. If we do that here with this massive temple in Ezekiel, here's what we're going to see together. What most Christians throughout history have believed, especially before the 1800s, is that this as a temple Ezekiel isn't meant, honestly, can't be taken to be a literal physical temple, whether in Ezekiel's day or in our future. And in fact, here's why I'm talking about this. In fact, thinking of it that way takes away from the point. Instead, God is using the same picture of a temple, like the temple he's just left, to show he's going to come back, but in a massive, greater, more heavenly way, in a way that was almost beyond what they could even fathom. All right. So that's just our introduction to this third section. And I know, and honestly, it's totally okay. Please hear me out. If so, I know for maybe a lot of you in here, you may not agree with that yet. You may still believe, especially things you taught, or things especially like on YouTube these days in the news, that this should be taken literalistically as a physical temple, or even if not that, honestly, for all of us in here, we probably don't know a lot about these chapters. We probably don't appreciate this massive promise that God is making in his word. But since we're here, worshipers of God, and this is God's word, and since this is actually quite an amazing promise from God, which brings a lot of glory to Jesus, where you get there. So now, because of all that, we're going to talk about, for our third section, just 6 aspects about this temple, Ezekiel, 6 aspects which A, help us appreciate what this is actually saying and how it connects to Jesus, but also B, that I want you to know, I think, help prove that this isn't supposed to be a literalistic physical temple. Rather, it's a picture. Here's the point. It is a picture fulfilled in Jesus, who is the great temple, the living water, the final sacrifice, and it's a picture that is ultimately, eventually leading to the new heavens and new earth.
because John closes the Revelation. We're going to cover that in 2 minutes to go. But put your thinking caps on. I do think this will be interesting and encouraging, and 6 aspects here about this huge temple prophecy in Ezekiel 40 through 48. Number 1, for aspect number 1, so hopefully you're already in Ezekiel 40. You can turn there if not. And the first thing on this whole vision, church, to notice is how it right away opens. Something in here, because there's something even in these first words here I want you to see that almost prove that this is a heavenly symbolic vision of God's greater presence. See it for yourself, please. Look at Ezekiel 40. We're only going to read verses 1 and 2. In the 25th year of our exile, there you go, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was struck down, on that very day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me to the city. In visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain, on which was a structure like a city to the south. On verse 1 there, this is much later, as I've told you, 25 years after the exile happened. And again, this is this whole book ending here. 9 chapters about this temple. And still in verse 1, notice Ezekiel's clear that it's brought to the same city they were exiled from. So that's the city of Jerusalem. And yet, church, with that said, the really important thing to notice here is, look again at verse 2. This is specifically what Ezekiel is brought to, what he sees, where he goes. Verse 2. In visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain, on which was a structure like a city to the south. All right, specifically, the reason that verse is so important to understand the rest of this vision is 2 quick things. First, notice Ezekiel says from God's word that he's brought to, quote, a very high mountain. And that's important because I want you to know, in the whole Old Testament, Jerusalem is never said to be on a very high mountain, nor is the region around it said to be like that. Because Jerusalem, right now, is elevated on a hill, but it's never in the Hebrew language said to be on a very high mountain. That term would just not be used of the land of Jerusalem. Rather, that phrase, very high, would have made the original readers think of God the Most High. So they would have thought, okay, this is a heavenly mountain. This is something different. It's different in the vision. Plus, the second thing to notice is it's not only that Ezekiel's brought to this very high mountain, but then, this is important, the whole, quote, structure like a city that is about to describe, which is we're going to see is huge, is on this very high mountain. So this mountain, very high, is big enough and flat enough to hold this whole structure of a city. And so, in summary, there's no very high mountain around Jerusalem, and certainly no very high mountain that could hold a huge, giant structure we're about to talk about. And to be really clear, those who want to take this literalistically, to do so, what they say is that God will literally raise up the geography of Jerusalem in the millennium to do this. And in fact, I read somebody this week who said, quote, that's, quote, the whole Palestinian topography will undergo geographical modifications at the beginning of the millennium, end quote. That's why we clearly church. That's fine to think that. God, of course, could do that. That is not what Ezekiel was communicating. Rather, it seems that the original readers most likely would have seen that this is now talking about a very high heavenly vision and promise from God. Meaning this is not going to be about another physical, earthly, literal temple, especially because the first one didn't work. Rather, this is vision of God using temple language to make a point. All right, that's just aspect 1. To understand, hopefully appreciate this. But now we will go quicker. And so now we're continuing on, and similar to that, for aspect 2, now turn to the ending of Ezekiel 42. Stickly, Ezekiel 42, 15 through 20. So look for Ezekiel 43 and just go right above that. So after chapter 40, some descriptions of the temple. We're going to get more into all of that. But then in chapter 42, Ezekiel is given the actual dimensions of the temple. And that's just saying what God's word says. Ezekiel 42, 15 through 20. When he had finished measuring the interior of the temple area, he led me out by the gate that faced east and measured the temple area all around. He measured the east side with the measuring reed, 500 cubits by the measuring reed all around. He measured the north side, 500 cubits by the measuring reed all around.
He measured the south side, 500 cubits by the measuring reed. And then he turned to the west side to measure 500 cubits by its measuring reed. He measured it on the four sides. It had a wall around it, 500 cubits long and 500 cubits broad, to make a separation between the holy and the common. All right. Just think of it. What we need to note here is that in the original Hebrew, the word cubit is not the original. Rather, he just takes a measuring reed, and it says that he measured it 500 by 500 by 500 by 500. And therefore, that means, if you're originally listening to this, number one, you'd understand that this temple is clearly a square, just like the most holy place of God was a square. And B, or number two, as for its sides, this is at least 1 by 1 mile giant square, which is huge for a structure, just like it would be today. And in fact, that size would have engulfed their whole ancient city of Jerusalem. And then they would have known that. And again, that connects to aspect number one, because so far we've got this very high mountain on which the structure like a city is built. And now this shows it is a massive complex, bigger than even their whole city at the time. Church, for us, that being true, maybe you can sense what God's getting across about the coming of his greater presence. All right, that's aspect two. Which next. Now, at least what I think is the most helpful on all of this, and church, also the most beautiful. And so this is really well be that for us. It's just heading for really connects to us. So for this, turn to Ezekiel 47 with me. Ezekiel 47, verses 1 through 12. It's pretty worth it. And church, this really is a beautiful picture. It's one a lot of us will easily understand. And this is a decent-sized passage, but I think it's worth reading in full. And as you just hear this, we will cover all of it. To think of Eden, I think of Jesus. All right, Ezekiel 47, 1 through 12. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple, facing toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by the way of the north gate, and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the water was trickling out on the south hand side. Going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits and led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. Again, he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again, he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Again, he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river, and as I went back, I saw on the bank of the river very many trees, on the one side and on the other. And he said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah and enters the sea. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live. And there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the sea may become fresh, so everything will live wherever it goes. Fishermen will stand beside the sea, from En-gedi to En-eglaim. It will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of very many kinds that fish the great sea, but its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. And on the banks, on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. All right, so what's the point there? Well, from this temple, water is flowing out. Like, remember, Eden, water came out and spread into many rivers. And the point here is something similar is happening, but it's even greater. And it's not just that the water keeps going, but Ezekiel himself is following the water, and miraculously, it gets higher and higher as it goes. Trickle, ankle deep, knee deep, waist deep, and it's so deep that he can't even pass through it, with no references to tributaries or mountains flowing into it. Instead, the point is, as the water from God's presence goes out, it's going to incredibly get bigger and bigger, deeper and deeper. It makes everything fresh. And then notice, every living creature that swims
lives, and fish of many kinds swim in this river. And to be frank, church, this is a chapter that's by far the hardest to read literal to us do. We're thinking that this would be a physical river, and that this is just fish. And why? Well, because first, notice again, the water is running from below the threshold of the temple. And just so you know, the temple in Jerusalem, there's no water underneath there. And so hearers would know that, and they know that this is just symbolic. And again, people who take this literalistically know that. They say that God's going to cause a spring to flow up from underneath the steps of the temple. But again, it's this how the original hearers did credit. Instead, this is more so symbolizing that from God's very presence, water, the life, freshness is flowing out. And then again, reason that too was can't be relatable, so it gets deeper and deeper without any references to tributaries or mountains, making it deeper. And it impacts fish of all kindness, many kindness. And so really, the point isn't a physical river. That's missing the point. Instead, this is living water flowing out from God, blessing the world, leading to healing and wholeness. Which, by the way, John said, quote this in Revelation 22, about to give everyone to new earth, all thanks to Jesus. And one last point in this typically means will it in his home, and to bring this to us, church, just think of this. It's also the New Testament. It's Jesus, who in John chapter 2, you probably know, he's the one that stands out and makes it very clear that he's the temple. Destroy this temple in 3 days, I will rise it up. So they have this temple promise. And also he shows up, he's like, I'm the temple. But then also John chapter 7, get this. So Jesus, at this point, is teaching in the actual temple. And while there, basically he says this, John 7, 38 and 39. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Meaning, be the church, I think in a real way, what we just read about God's presence is having a temple and that presence flowing with living water that gets deeper and deeper for healing for the world and life. We should read that and realize this is a picture of Jesus' presence. It's a picture of the blessing of the Spirit they have because of fruit. And as a quick side note, this is why we're going into detail on this here. By the way, this is just a lot. That's because seeing all this in light of the New Testament church should help us to appreciate what we have in Jesus. You get that? Because you and I, right now, as fish here of many kinds, we're drinking of this water flowing from the temple of Jesus. All right. So that's just aspect number 3. Now we're going to go even quicker. We've got 3 more. It is now, as for aspect number 4, we won't go to Ezekiel for this, but this is now just thinking about what isn't in this temple in these chapters. Because in brief, church, we need to know, especially if you're still thinking that this is just another Old Testament-like temple, real quickly, the issue is that there are 9 important things in here. There are 9 important things of the Old Testament temple that are not referenced here at all. So stick with me. In these chapters, there's no bronze basin, number 1. There's no number 2, golden lampstand, number 3, no bread of the presence, number 4, no altar of the incense, no number 5, oil of the priest, number 6, bigger down, there's no high priest, which is a big deal for them. Number 7, there's no veil separating the holy place. Number 8, there's no cherubim, and this is the most important one. Number 9, there's no Ark of the Covenant here. And again, all of that matters to show that this is a symbolic rather than a literal vision. Because if this was another temple structure, yes, there would be a lot of things in here, but they would mention those things. There's a lot of sacrifices talked about, but all these things are missing. And why? Especially the Ark of the Covenant, well, to emphasize God is in all of this. It's this massive presence of God, not a reduplication of a physical temple. All right, next, this aspect number 5. And this, on the flip side, is now just us taking a minute to describe what's in here. All right, so if you're to read this on your own, you should wonder, okay, so what's in all these chapters and verses if those 9 things aren't in here? And I encourage you, please, especially after this morning, go read this for yourself, and you'll see the emphasis over and over is on these 3 big realities. 3 realities. First is that God is present in the whole thing. Second is the size of it over and over. And third, church, is the sacrifices. So stick with me. God bigness, sacrifices, and even sensing. That also fits so well with the New Testament, especially with the author of Hebrews makes it crystal clear that the temple sacrifices were imperfect and were all leading to the once and final sacrifice of Jesus. Plus, the New Testament is clear. There are no more sacrifices to come now that Jesus has arrived. And I'm just seeing how Christians, you want to take this literalistically, also know that there's a ton of sacrifices in here, and they're Christians, so they know that there's no more sacrifices after Jesus. And so what they say is that basically in the millennium, when this temple was built, there'll be all these sacrifices, but they're just going to be memorial sacrifices, meaning they only remember Jesus. Here's the big issue with that. Ezekiel 40-48, you should read it. There are burnt offerings, grain offerings, drink offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings described. And the author of Hebrews makes clear those are to do no more now that Jesus has come. So the point is, instead of seeing all of those sacrifices as just somehow becoming real and memorialized in the physical temple, rather to appreciate Jesus more, church, we should read the emphasis on God's presence, on God's goodness in the sacrifices, and again, think of Jesus fulfilled all. All right, I know it's a lot. It's 5 and over 6 aspects, which finally leads us to aspect number 6. And for this, we're going to read a verse. We're going to read the very end of Ezekiel. It's our last verse of the morning. Thanks for sticking with us. Hope it was worth it. And for this, we're going to be in Ezekiel 48 through verse 35. 48. It's literally the last book and last verse of the book. Again, this is the climactic ending. He ends with this because this really is the point. So look at Ezekiel 48, verse 35. The circumference of the city shall be 18,000 cubits, and the name of the city from that time on shall be, the Lord is there. All right, so imagine you're in your whole book of Ezekiel, and then, just like you listened to me for those 20 minutes or so, imagine reading the 9 chapters of Ezekiel 40 through 48. As Israelite, it's just some massive heavenly reality on a very high mountain. This is symbolic of God's presence. The God who just drove out. There's water flowing from this temple. There's many kinds of fish. And finally now, and what's the name of all of this? The Lord is there. He's there. Meaning God is present again, but in an even greater way than the Old Testament temple that he just left. And so yes, God uses temple and city imageries, but this is not about a literalistic temple to be fulfilled. That's just not the point. And honestly, it can't be. The temple's too big. There's no very high mountain. There's no water underneath the threshold. They would have known that. Rather, the point is God's presence is going to come again, but in an even greater way. That's what they would feel. A way that the temple was only a picture of. It's going to be bigger, better, more heavenly, better sacrifices, filling up what was supposed to happen from Eden with the water. That's coming. And the summary of it is, the Lord's there. Or, as the New Testament says, Jesus is God with us. Or even better, in John 1, you're going to talk about this next week. Jesus tabernacles among us, full of grace and truth. And in Jesus, we see the glory of the Lord, the same glory of the glory that left the tent. All right, and that's our passages for the Seago Church. I know all these messages have been a good amount of information, especially this one. And so that's good learning. But now let's just put the close by directly therefore asking, so what's this mean now? What does this actually mean for us? The answer to that, let's just quickly remember why we were doing this series, right? Because remember, it's so that you may appreciate Christmas more, both theologically, but also, as we said, existentially, kind of in our daily lives, appreciating and living in light of Jesus coming 2,000 years ago. And so we've talked a lot of theology this morning, but now existentially, what's this all mean? Well, think of it this way. So think of God, who is real, and us, church, we'll just realize that God is the one who had all this happen in the Old Testament. Right, from us being kicked out of Eden, to then him doing the tabernacle, to then him leaving the temple, to then him promising in this 9-chapter hyperbolic vision that he's going to come back. That's all God's doing. And knowing that, therefore think, why would you do that, God, then? Why? Well, why not just come once and say, hey, I'm with you? And what you can probably sense from God's perspective, it's so that when he was beginning to come and this be fulfilled, when God did return, it's so that his people so that the world, so that we right now would feel, this is a big deal. God has come. And now God is with me, in me, by his Spirit. And that's not just words. And not only that, but apparently God is the one who, in this whole story, wanted to make it clear that he wanted that. To be near to even sinners like you and me. And again, that matters and connects to our lives, because that means existentially for you and me, yes, let's be real, that in our day and days out, we know our lives may feel pretty mundane. We're all in here really stressed and tired and struggling with sins and busy, all of us, because we're all still living as fallen sinners in a cursed world. The full restoration hasn't come yet. But church, we should know. We should seek to feel this more. That you and I are also the privileged to live this far along in the timeline of the story that God has written for his presence. And he is clear. He's with us in a powerful way, especially if you trust in Jesus. And that being true, therefore, that should impact your and my lives. Of course, it should impact things like how I think of myself and my existence and my mattering, because God has said he is with me if I trust in Jesus. It should think how we look at other believers, like in this room, or any other believer, because we should be amazed that every one of you who trusts in Jesus, you have God's Spirit in you. The same God who left the temple is in you. Or since God calls us gathered together, a church, his temple, it should make us probably prioritize this body and this church more. All because God is truly with us, in us. That's huge. If it is here. Let's say that one last way, church, as we close, begin with this. Summing it all up. I think one last time the Israelites, Ezekiel was like, I think it's how I feel. They were asked, you zoom back in time, they were asked, tell me about God's presence. They would have thought of the Garden of Eden being kicked out, and they especially would have thought of the tabernacle and their temple. But in their day, we just read it. God left the temple. And so now what? Where God was saying, I'm going to come back. I'm going to be bigger, better, fuller, more intimately comprehensive way that he need for you and for the whole world. And he did. At Christmas, in the gospel of Jesus. Which is why, after his resurrection, Jesus could say, and I'll be with thee always, even to the end of the age. Church, especially as Christmas seasons, believe that and live life. Amen. Let's pray and let's